if you were the devil and you wanted to get a hold of some Christians, what would you do? And it would be you would flatter them about their reputation in order to get them to do things that God hates, or sanction things, or mute themselves in the face of things that God hates.
Welcome to the Plain Speech Podcast. My name is Michael Clary. My guest today is Dr. Joe Rigney, whose book, Leadership and Emotional Sabotage, was a big hit last year, and he's followed it up with another book called The Sin of Empathy. Before I get to the interview, though, I want to let you know about the King's Domain Conference that is coming up this May, 8 through 10, in Cincinnati, Ohio, or actually just across the river in Kentucky, where our new location is. The conference is called Future-Proof Christianity, and Dr. Rigney is one of our keynote speakers. The conference's aim is to answer a simple question. What do Christians need to do now to prepare for the next 20 years? And we invited Dr. Rigney because his insights have proven invaluable time and again, both to me personally, to my ministry, and to my church. And we think that he will equip you to be a more faithful Christian in the years to come. I'd like to personally invite you to come and be a part of this conference. I'm very excited about it. I think it'll be very edifying and helpful for Christians of all ages and life stages. It's this May, 8 through 10. And I want to sneak in a little bonus. If you use the promo code PSP, that's Plain Speech Podcast, promo code PSP when you register, you'll get $10 off the ticket price, which is already pretty cheap. It's $120 per person. And really, for the caliber of speakers that we have coming, that's really a great, great price. And you'll hear from other great speakers. So future-proof pastors like Jeff Durbin, Tom Askell, C.R. Wiley, Michael Foster, David Schrock, and myself, we will round out the lineup of keynote speakers. So I hope you come. Futureproofchristianity.com is where you go. Futureproofchristianity.com. That's where you go to register. You'll get all the information that you need there, and I hope to meet you there in person. And now on with the interview. Hope you enjoy this interview with Dr. Rigney. Joe Rigney, I'm sure you're making the rounds with podcasts promoting your latest book, The Sin of Empathy. I'm wondering at this stage, can you tell me, are there any questions that you would expect or think people should be asking that nobody is asking yet?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Because the ones the ones you expect them to ask, they ask. It's always about, like, are you actually saying empathy is bad? And it's like, it's a complicated question. I think the thing is people think this is way simpler than it is. The common thing I run into is people think this is super obvious and easy, and I am complicating it by saying, no, we have to make distinctions, and there's more going on in this whole discussion. But part of the issue, I think that the biggest hiccup that I run into is people who, who don't get that I'm not trying to fight about words. Like, I'm using words. I have to use words. I have my preferred ways of talking about empathy and sympathy and compassion and so forth. But if somebody else is using the word slightly differently, because these are overlapping concepts, I'm like, that's cool. We can still talk. Let's just see if we can get to some substantive agreement. And it's amazing. There are people who will absolutely refuse to do that. They are like, we are going to disagree with you. We just do not like what you're doing.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to talk about emotion, passions, things that we feel using rational thought, logical categories. And the reaction that I've seen to your book and your teaching on the subject, it seems to elicit lots and lots of emotion and passion and not a lot of clarity and logic. And you're trying to bring clarity to the discussion.
Right.
So you published the book, last one, Leadership and Emotional Sabotage. Can you compare the reaction to that book to the reaction to this book?
Yeah, I'd say that book went over a lot better. That's it's interesting. That's I've written 8 books now, I don't know. It's a there's a decent amount over the last decade, and Leadership and Emotional Sabotage is by far the bestseller. It's not, and I don't think it's close. I don't actually know the totals that I've done for, like, Things of Earth. For a long time, it's like Things of Earth was my main books. Then Strangely Bright outsold Things of Earth. So, like, those are the big ones, And so then Lewis book, and Live Like a Narnian has sold pretty well over, it's had a lot longer run, but in a year and a half now, I guess, I don't know, maybe it's only been a year. Leadership and Emotional Sabotage just blew them all out of the water because, and I don't know exactly what to attribute that to, and it hasn't met with the same hostility as the other. Like people aren't, because the title doesn't provoke them in the same way that Sin of Empathy provokes them. And the relationship between the two books, I would describe as kind of, you could think of it as prequel. So um, Leadership and Emotional Sabotage is like the solution, and then Sin of Empathy is a deeper dive on at least some aspects of the problem it's trying to address. It's like more of a diagnostic. And then, so if you think of that, diagnosis, Sin of Empathy, prescription, solution, Emotional Sabotage, that's the way that those two books kind of relate. But the title is far more like, there's a section in Emotional Sabotage called The Sin of Empathy. Like there's a section, but it's just a little section in a much larger book that's doing a lot more on the like positive side. Like this is what we should be. And then it was basically, I had actually started to put together Sin of Empathy before I even got into Sabotage. I was working on that when I was still at Bethlehem. I was like, hey, I've got all these essays. Period. I've been doing this for 7 or 8 years. People get, every now and then it recirculates. The empathy wars break out again, and I'm just pointing people to articles all the time. And it would be nice if there was just a book. And so I was like, let's combine all of the essays into a book. And then when I moved out to Moscow, Canon asked for Sabotage first. They said, hey, let's go full Friedman translation, deep dive, bring in the Shakespeare. Like, let's do that first. And so I worked that one up, but I had the other one kind of sitting there, all of these articles, 7 or 8 or 9 articles that I'd written on empathy over the years. And it was just sitting there. And then after Sabotage launched, then it was like, okay, do we want to just do this book of essays? And Canon said, no, let's actually make it a book, not just sort of collected essays. And so then I started, basically plundering them, like picking things and rearranging things and trying to weave them together into kind of a more coherent whole. And so then that's where that came from. And so they're actually out of order at some level. Like you could have published Sin of Empathy first. And then it's like, that was the problem. Now here's the solution. And I did it the other way, but it's fine. Mm-hmm. Eventually they're both out there, and one of them makes people really, really mad, and the other just helps people a lot.
Yeah. So the word empathy, is it even in the Bible?
It depends on your translation. The only, as of now, I'm sure there's so many English translations. The mainstream translation that includes it is the NIV. So the NIV revisions, and I think the only place, there may be more now, because this is part of what I'm after, is like there's a migration happening, and it's not just, and while the words aren't the main point, the words are signaling something. And so Jesus, we do not have a high priest who's unable to empathize with our weaknesses. So every other translation says sympathize. And the reason that every other translation, English translation, King James, ESV, New American Standard, all of them translate it sympathize, is because the Greek word is sympathizo, which is kind of nice. So if, it's nice when they do that. And it's literally, we're just bringing over this Greek word into English that means to suffer with. But the NIV at some point had decided, hey, that word has different connotations. Sympathize is not as good. It's not good enough. Okay. And I think that's one thing that people do misunderstand. Back to your original question, other things that people don't ask. It's like, what got you into this? Why'd you do this? Well, one of the reasons was because people were bad-mouthing sympathy, right? There are these videos that might as well, there's people that are basically doing the sin of sympathy. Brene Brown basically does a video. This is one of the things that got me into this, where it's this little bitty viral video clip that's been out for 7 or 8 years now, in which she basically says sympathy's bad. It feels disconnection. It's aloof. It's cold. It's judgmental. It's oh, I don't want to get into the pit with you. And then, but empathy, let me tell you about empathy. The good news of empathy is it feels connection, and it's a sacred space, and it's all of the good things. And you watch that and you go, well, sympathy's in my Bible a lot, actually. I can find that. And yet here she is saying sympathy's bad. And she's, and this is being used by Christian ministries to talk about how to help hurting people. Like I saw it used that way. And so I thought, well, I don't want to lose the Bible word. And I want to actually understand what's going on. And so this is where Edwin Friedman was helpful, because he talked about this linguistic shift from suffering with sympathy to suffering in. So empathy literally means to suffer in. And that's a little clue that something may be going on. It implies a deeper, fuller, more total engagement and sharing of the emotions of the sufferer, or at least a deeper feeling of sadness at their hardship. And people think that sounds better than sympathy, which is, again, there's a little emotional distance. We kind of keep a little bit of a gap. And in the modern world, that's unacceptable. And we need to do this total immersion thing. And that's precisely what I was concerned about. That's what Friedman was concerned about. It's what C.S. Lewis was concerned about, though using different terms, is that emotions are powerful. They sweep us off our feet. And so if we go where other people's emotions want to take us, then we can lose touch with reality pretty quick. And that's what I mean by the sin of empathy. It's the empathy that becomes untethered from reality. So some people, just by empathy, they mean sharing emotions, feeling for people, walking a mile in their shoes, that sort of thing. And I go, all sounds great, as long as you're anchored to reality. And I think people underestimate how easy it is to lose touch with reality when the emotions are raging.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember the Brene Brown video. It was used in a training that I attended for exactly the purpose that you stated. It's like you need to basically be emotionally enmeshed with the other person that's suffering, such that you enter into their I guess the complete orbit of their pain, and you do lose touch with reality, and that's that I like the way you put that, because it's like that is a phenomena that seems fairly common, to where people will argue for things and be very emotional and argue for stuff that just seems completely detached from any sort of earthy lived experience that we have, with transgenderism being one example. It's just like you're totally untethered from the biological reality of your sex. And then the people that see, well, this person is suffering in some way, so we must empathize with them, which means to kind of enter into that, affirm it, never challenge it, because to truly love that person is to lose reality with them. Is that a fair assessment?
Exactly. So one of the ways, in one of the earliest things I did on the subject, which is included in the book as an appendix, I did these 2 screw tape letters, style for Desiring God. And in the first one, and when I did them, the main one I wanted to write was the sin of empathy one. But I knew that people were going to misunderstand. And so I said, let me anticipate some objections. And so I wrote a first one, which was basically kind of going after ham-fisted compassion, the sort of like somebody's hurting and you just wave Bible verses at them because you're uncomfortable that they're so sad. All things work together for good, but it's done, and it's a kind of mask for your own agitation and anxiety about their suffering. And so you're saying, I'm trying to comfort you, but I'm actually trying to correct you, right? I'm trying to like steer you a little bit because your emotions are too uncomfortable. And I'd seen that, I'd done that, I'd been on the receiving end of that. And I thought, so most people, if you said, hey, there's ways in which in the name of compassion, we can actually be kind of stupid. We just really don't comfort people. We won't enter into their pain because we find it too uncomfortable. And so we try to correct them instead. So I wrote a whole essay on that, in which I put God, had the demons encouraging people, get the people to use God works all things together for good. And you go, what? That's Bible verses. And I was like, yeah, and Bible verses get misused. So I wrote that and then said, so that would be, we're going to actually not do compassion. We're going to do correction instead. And then I said, but the real thing I want to get to is sin of empathy. So then I get into that. And the way I talk about it is it's the attempt to allow someone else to steer your emotional vehicle. So you have an emotional vehicle, you have emotions. And what you're doing is you're saying, here, you can steer my emotional vehicle. Wherever you want to drive this car, I'll go. Which means if they decide I am going to curse God and die because I'm so angry at him, and I'm so sad and frustrated, Job's wife, then empathy says, I will let you take me wherever you go. I will lose touch with reality. And that was the phenomenon that I was seeing wreak havoc. I was thinking mainly in church context, but then it sort of widens out into this larger cultural phenomenon. And that was the thing that I was concerned about. And so it was like, let's just go straight at it. Let's just hit it straight up. Empathy is dangerous. Empathy, and in this modern form, how it's used is actually a tool of emotional blackmail, emotional manipulation. And it's not good. And the other thing I think that people misunderstand is I think a lot of people, when they enter in this conversation, they think that I'm mainly concerned about the person trying to manipulate, right? Mm-hmm. So they think that I'm pointing fingers at them. So when I say that, men can be manipulated by women, that good men find the agitation and displeasure of women really hard to deal with because we want them to feel good. We don't want them to be mad at us. And so we get steered. And people think, oh, there you are, the woman you gave me, you're blaming the woman. I say, I am actually doing the opposite. There's the reason it's called the sin of empathy and not the sin of manipulation. I'm not mainly concerned, I would like them to stop it. I would like the manipulators and the reactive and the immature and so forth. I would like them to knock it off. But I don't think that they will. I think this is a human phenomenon that we will have, the manipulators you will always have with you. The issue for the rest of us is to say, how do we resist that manipulation while still maintaining tenderheartedness and compassion and kindness like the Bible commands? So my target is there's a reason it's called the sin of empathy and not the sin of manipulation. That would be easy to go after, and I would probably get a lot of amens, mm-hmm. right? Because everybody would go, oh, sin of manipulation. Oh yeah, we hate it. And they would probably, and you could say, look, there's right-wing versions of this, and there's left-wing versions, and there's this, and there's that, and it would be much more palatable. But that is, if I get manipulated, it's other people's fault. And I'm saying, no. If you get manipulated, it's your fault. You're responsible for you. That's the point, is that you need to maintain your anchor in what is true and what is good. As a Christian, you need to be anchored to Christ and be compassionate the way he is. And that means you're going to resist that flattery.
I have been in ministry for over 20 years. I've seen massive cultural changes in that time. The iPhone was only invented in 2007. But since then, technology has advanced at breakneck speed with seemingly little moral reflection on potential abuses. Gay marriage was invented by the Supreme Court in 2015. In its wake, woke ideologies and the LGBTQ movement have pressured Christians to conform or face cancellation. All the while, church attendance has declined, with many churches giving themselves over to the spirit of the age. COVID opened up people's eyes to government overreach, not to mention corruption in science and medicine. And we now know many prominent Christian leaders and institutions were complicit. Some prominent leaders of the 2000s and 2010s showed a lack of discernment when it was most needed, and they heaped scorn on fellow Christians who questioned the state-mandated orthodoxy. Some people had the courage to raise the alarm, and they were ridiculed for it. They were accused of being divisive and unchristlike. But recently, things have been changing. There's optimism in the air. God has given us a real opportunity for change that can turn our nation back from disaster. In other words, God has given us an inch. Let's take a mile. The emerging generation of Christians are more conservative. The fields are white for the harvest. The church has an opportunity to reach them for Christ and disciple them to be godly churchmen and responsible statesmen. Many of the leaders I trusted in my early ministry have proven unreliable. Who should we trust for guidance in the next 20 years? There's nothing new under the sun. God has a way of rewarding faithfulness in men who are willing to pay a price for truth. In our day, a few men are aiming to follow their example. I want to learn from those leaders who got it right before, who saw what was happening, called it out, and paid a price for it. The men who sounded the alarm before have been vindicated. These are the men who can faithfully guide us into the next 20 years. These men understand the times. They can equip us for a future-proof Christianity. Join us. Yeah. You used a word there just a moment ago, flattery, which I think is a great, it's a great word, but I'm going to restrain myself from chasing that rabbit.
Okay.
I think what I've observed is that compassion has become a control virtue, such that it's elevated above all the others. It's like Jesus said, the first and second great commandments: love God first, then love your neighbors yourself. But it seems like compassion has been elevated even above love, to where any action that one takes, for it has to be there has to be some demonstration of compassion, or if it lacks compassion, it is immediately suspect. And so I think of an example of, a Christian judge who is sentencing a criminal to prison. Um, we like the judge that would say, I do this with a broken heart,
Right.
because it senses like, well, there is compassion in this. So it's like, okay, since there's compassion in the mix, then we know that you've checked the box that must be checked in every situation. You can never do something purely for the rightness of the act if it's a hard decision. There must be some element of feeling invoked in that act to make it righteous. Is that, would you say that is in the mix here of what you see with the sin of empathy?
Yeah, I think that's in there, and I understand, and there's a good reason for it, right? So you think about God shows mercy to us, and he, or you think about and so his mercy has a primacy relative to, say, his judgment. He does not willingly afflict the children of men, Lamentations, and so there's the idea that, like, when God judges, he does, I think that it's literally like with his whole heart. He doesn't do it with his whole heart, because he cares about you, and it's a tragedy when his creatures rebel against him, and in his justice he brings the punishment. At the same, so like there's a real thing there. At the same time, we have texts where God's like, I delight to show judgment, and so he's like, man, this is more complicated. On the one hand he does, and on the one hand he doesn't, and it's like God is communicating the complexity, both of how he reveals himself to us, but then also modeling for us both of those. And so that reluctance, I can't just do the right thing, I can't just sentence the criminal, feels compassionate. But the reason it feels compassionate is because it tends to be myopic. And so this is one of the big things in all of my research and working on empathy, is that empathy, especially when it's dialed up, and you can call it compassion too, that's fine. Like, when it gets dialed up, it becomes really narrow. Like it fixates on certain worthy objects of empathy. And in doing so, it loses sight of others. So often this is what happens in, like, the criminal justice system, where the criminal being sentenced, we feel bad that we're having to sentence him. But in that moment, have we lost sight of the victim, right? Where you might say, whereas if your eyes were on the victim, you might feel a sense of satisfaction. Justice was done. And it's compassion for the victim that leads you to have this sense of rightness of your sentence. And I think that that's a major player. And this has been my main response to someone like David French. So David French over the years has engaged, I think 2 or 3 times in his newsletter with my stuff on empathy, and he does not like it at all. He thinks it's a power play. Now he talks about it as a power play by Christian nationalists to justify their cruelty. That's his analysis of my work. And what got him into it is that my stuff was circulating back during COVID, and he was appalled by death shaming, even as someone who I think was more aligned with the regime and the COVID regime and defer to the experts and all this sort of stuff. And so was not a fan of the folks who were defying all of that. He still, and to his credit, recognized that, hey, when people who don't get the jab or who won't mask up contract COVID, and then for whatever reason, and then they die, that there was this kind of rejoicing among, the regime, right? The most empathetic people were all of a sudden like, good riddance, right? Well, that's what you get. And he was just shocked by this. And he said, there's an empathy deficit in our country. And we have this lack of empathy And meanwhile, you've got this pastor guy in Minnesota talking about the sin of empathy. Oh man, this is the moment when we need more of it. And I said, what I thought, my response to him was basically, look, the reason that you have that, he said, our problem is selective empathy. And I said, the reason it's selective is because it's excessive. It's the excess that leads it to fixate on certain approved groups. And in principle, though, that could be any different groups. Different people might have different approved groups. I feel empathy for them and not for them. But in the moment in which we were living, it was very clear that it was progressives identified worthy groups. So to feel empathy for racial minorities, for women, for sexual, quote unquote, sexual minorities, those people needed empathy. And so anything you did towards them had to have that reluctance, and that even if you were a Christian, it's like, yeah, well, we have to say that homosexuality is bad, but we feel kind of bad that we have to tell you and ruin your dreams. It was that kind of reluctance because there were the objects of compassion. Meanwhile, the coal miner in the red hat, he does not get empathy.
Right.
Okay. The COVID resistor did not get empathy. And what French failed to realize is it's because we have too much emotion and feeling running amok. It's the passions are in control. They're not anchored and tethered to what is true and what is good. And therefore, people feel really, really compassionate towards one group and therefore intense hatred and cruelty for another. And this is then, and so I was working with that and then discovered, much to my not surprise, satisfaction, that C.S. Lewis said literally that 70 years ago when he wrote that pity, when disconnected from the moral law as a whole, justice and charity, leads through a very natural process to anger, or through anger to cruelty. So pity leads through anger to cruelty. And it was like, that's it, right? Pity and anger like correlate because you feel compassion for this group and therefore anger towards their oppressors. And therefore you can justify all manner of cruelty against their oppressors. And that's what I think people fail to recognize is this is why Paul Bloom, when he wrote his book long before I did, he's a secular thinker. His book's called Against Empathy, which if he hadn't had that title, that would have been a really good title. I would have liked that title, but he used it. So I was okay. I gotta use sin of empathy. But in his book, he says, when most people think empathy, they think of kindness. I think of war. And it's like, that's what, like, when you look at the Middle East, you should think a lot of empathy happening there. It's all empathy. Yes. That's what's going on. And because it's the Muslims have empathy for their co-religionists, right? The Palestinians, and therefore they hate and want to wipe Israel off the map. Meanwhile, Israel has compassion on its citizens and empathy for the citizens, and therefore can justify, all sorts of stuff on the other side. So, and I'm not adjudicating the matter. I'm just saying, like, the phenomenon is empathy for one group means cruelty or an anger towards their enemies.
Yeah, what you said there at the end reminds me of the proverb, just that, what is it? The mercy of the wicked is cruel. And I think the mercy there would be the empathy of the wicked is cruel.
Yes.
And you and I had a conversation about this at some point in the past. I don't remember when, but you were recalling Lewis's teaching about the greater the virtue, the more wicked its sinful manifestation. Can you flesh that a bit here? I think that'd be helpful.
Yeah, that was another one. So, and kind of how that came about was when the sin of empathy stuff dropped first. So the Man Rampant episode with Doug, as well as those screw tape letters, where I actually used the sin of empathy was the phrase, and people erupted, and their main objection, ostensibly, was, that's not what empathy means. You're twisting words, and I'm going, well, that's what people hide behind. So can I attack the vice using its assumed name? Let's say empathy in and of itself is a fine name. Okay, great. It's hiding a lot of junk. Can I attack the junk in the name it's using? But then I said, you know what? Let's see if I can actually address this. Let's just set aside this semantic challenge that some people have, and I'll just hit it with different words. And so I wrote an article called Dangerous Compassion. This one got incorporated into the book too. in which I said, I'm not going to use the word empathy at all, but I am going to hit the exact same thing. And I'm going to use Lewis, because Lewis called it the passion of pity. That was the phrase. And he said, that's the passion of pity, was the pity that we feel. It's the ache that we feel when someone's hurting that leads us to flatter when we should speak truth. It's a tool of emotional manipulation, right? It's using pity the wrong way around as a kind of emotional blackmail. It's sulking in order to get your way. That's the thing that he's talking about, and it shows up in Great Divorce. And then I connected that to his work in the Four Loves, where he does say, any natural love, whenever it becomes a god, it becomes a demon. Whenever it becomes a god, it becomes a demon. When it elevates itself to kind of the first place, when it becomes the premier virtue, or when it becomes God, it becomes really, really destructive. And so he always illustrates this with things like mother love. That recurs in his writings a lot. This maternal instinct, this maternal love. How could you be against something as high and holy as mother love? And he's like, because it can become a vampire, because it can just suck the life out of you, because it can become possessive, domineering, destructive. It's awful. And so he dramatizes that in a number of different books. But that's mother love, which he says is a great good, and it goes really wrong. Romantic love, same thing. Friendship, same thing. And so then all of a sudden, it doesn't take a stretch to go, well, if compassion is, if we defined it as love for the weak and the hurting and the broken, that's compassion. That's the kind of love it is. Love for the weak, hurting, broken. Is that a good thing? And you go, of course it is. Look at your Bible. Jesus is moved with compassion. He tells us to be kind and tenderhearted and have bowels of mercy. Like, this is clearly a glorious virtue. And it's like, okay, so what happens when it goes wrong? What happens when love for the weak and the hurting and the broken becomes untethered from what is true and good and right? What will it be? And it's like, it will be a really, really ugly demon. That's the basic argument. And I don't need the word empathy to make that point. It's just that in the modern context, whenever that happens, what word do people wave in front of that demon? And the answer is empathy. I was just looking the other day. Somebody sent me this fun little. You love it when other people do advertising for you. But I had some friends who were in Mexico, and they were on the Mexican side of the border, and they were driving down, and they looked over at the border wall. So this is from the Mexico side, looking at the wall, and on the wall was written in big letters, empathy. And I just thought, that's exactly what I'm talking about, because the idea, presumably the artist is saying, like, this wall is unempathetic. This border that you have, this boundary that you've erected, is not compassionate, it's not empathetic. And empathy would mean tear down this wall. And I just thought, yeah, that's exactly my point, is empathy makes you lose your boundaries. It demands, you used the word earlier, and this is one thing that my critics have always said this is their main argument is, oh, Rigney, what you're talking about is real, but the term for it is enmeshment. It's enmeshment. It's the lack of boundaries and borders where other people's emotions just flow into you, and then you just get swept along by him. That's codependency, and in enmeshment, it's fusion. And so don't call it empathy, call it enmeshment. And I'm like, but nobody goes around saying they did not write enmeshment on that wall. They wrote
Right.
empathy on that wall, right? Nobody says, well, I guess I'm going to do some enmeshment today. What people say is, I'm going to be empathetic today. And in the name of empathy, they do all sorts of sinful and destructive things. And so I want to say, okay, if that's what they call it, I'm going to call it that too.
Yeah. You use the word flattery again, so now you forced me to chase this rabbit.
Yeah.
One of my favorite scriptures of the last few years that's helped me to identify the phenomena that you're describing in its various manifestations is Romans 16, 17, and 18. Chapter 16, verses 17 and 18. I'll read it to you. He says, I appeal to you, brothers, to watch out for those who cause divisions and create obstacles contrary to the doctrine that you've been taught. Avoid them. So you would expect some Trinity deniers, or some people that are advocating sexual immorality or pagan child sacrifice or something. This is a very serious error that he's wanting to warn them about. And then verse 18, he says, for such persons do not serve our Lord Christ, but their own appetites. And then here's the money phrase. And by smooth talk and flattery, they deceive the hearts of the naive. The key features there being the way they speak, And that's like an empathetic person, a person who prides themselves on empathy, will absolutely speak with very smooth words, like, "Oh, I'm so sorry you feel that way. Man, I hate that that's happened to you. Wow, I really care about you." And they flatter the other person by assuming that person has done no wrong. They have no agency or culpability in whatever degree they're suffering. And it deceives naive people. And so I would see there are some people that are the pushers, kind of the drug pushers of the empathy drug. And then you have the naive users who are taking the drug, seeing that this is a good thing, and they don't even realize that they have swallowed a poison. And I think this text really nails it. It's like when you're looking out for a demonic ideology, don't look for the horns and the fangs with blood dripping off. Look for very nice, sweet, smooth talk, flattering that's deceiving naive people. That's where there's going to be a lot of error.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And I think this is how progressives figured out that this was a weak spot, is that Chris, so, and this was there was a couple of things that came together, and I'm glad, this is one of the reasons I'm glad that I waited to publish the book, because this wouldn't have been in there earlier. I didn't realize, I hadn't made these connections, but the connection was between the empathy stuff, but then what you might call respectability or credibility, and it's connected to this idea of flattery. Because the idea is that Christians care about their reputation, because the Bible says you should, right? A good name is to be chosen above riches, and Christian leaders need to be well thought of by outsiders. And so we go, having a good reputation is a good thing. Well, what makes a good reputation as a Christian? Well, the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but kind to everyone, able to teach, correcting others with gentleness. So that correcting with gentleness, that manner, that way, is a key element that the Bible commends to us as a mark of God's servants, his ministers. So then you take that and you say, I want to have a good reputation. Good reputation is defined as gentleness, kindness. Okay. Well, then now what you've just said is like, where's the trap? If you were the devil and you wanted to get a hold of some Christians, what would you do? And it would be, you would flatter them about their reputation in order to get them to do things that God hates, or sanction things, or mute themselves in the face of things that God hates, which is precisely what the left did. In order to be compassionate, if you want us to think of you as compassionate Christians, you must not talk about these things, and you must talk about those things. Here's certain issues that we're going to define compassion. Compassion means that you care about climate change. Compassion means that you care about refugees and immigrants. Compassion means that you care about abused women. And you go, what could be wrong with that? Don't you? And it's like, of course. But all of that was used as a kind of smokescreen to then say that, and the entailments was, that means you have to support crazy big government policies to deal with quote unquote climate change. It means that you must believe all women. It means that you can't question racial minorities when they say about their lived experience. You must accept it wholesale. You can't challenge it, question it, or question the policies that they would put in place to solve that problem. So again and again, it was, you can't have a border. You don't get to have a border because you care about refugees. And so all of those things, and it was what Christians wanted, is they wanted to be thought compassionate. And so it was the flattery was Christians who went along, you're the good Christians. You're the compassionate Christians. You're the kind Christians. And meanwhile, those Christians who said, but wait a minute, I think borders are good. And I think big government's is going to make this climate thing worse if it's even a problem at all. And no, sodomy's not good, and we're not going to sanction it. And on and you know what? If someone comes with accusations of sexual abuse, we ought to take that seriously, but we shouldn't just believe everything out of the gate without actually asking some questions. The minute you did that, what were you defined at? Harsh, callous, uncompassionate, unempathetic. You're heartless, and you don't want that reputation. And so that was where the flattery came in. The smooth talk was, do this. And the way that this got laundered was often not direct. It wasn't that, and I think this is one of the mistakes that sometimes critics of what's often called Big Eva or critics of the sort of the squishy Christians miss. My base brothers sometimes miss, I think, that it wasn't that those squishies were wanting approval directly from the New York Times or from the progressives in town. It was that they had basically adopted a frame that was reinforced and policed by other respectable Christians. That's who they were. It wasn't about the unbelievers directly. It was that, hey, we think that we're orienting to the world in such a way that we think will be calculated to appeal to those people should we ever meet them. But it's not directly about them. It's that other Christians that I respect will, if I resist this, they're going to say that I'm not being kind and compassionate, and I care what they think. And so the flattery often wasn't from the world directly, but it was from mentors. It was from older, I know of situations where older quote unquote wiser Christians basically got some young bucks to back down from resisting certain attempts at sabotage because they said, hey, kindness would demand this. This is what, don't care so much about being right. You're fixated on what's true, on what's right and your own rightness. And instead you should just be kind and compassionate and humble, right? Be humble, be winsome. And it was those words that were used not from the world, but from other Christians to say, let's back off. And the world discovered, man, okay, that's the place where we can steer them.
The world is changing so fast. Technology, culture, politics, ethics. As things change faster than ever, it's hard to keep up. Christians need to stand firm, but how can we stay grounded in the midst of so much change? How can we prepare ourselves, our children, and our churches for an uncertain future? It's not impossible. We can prepare ourselves, but not by chasing cultural trends, silly church gimmicks, or progressive theological fads. Rather, we prepare ourselves by being anchored in the unchanging truth of God's Word. We need a future-proof Christianity. The future belongs to Christians who live the old ways in a new world. Future-proof Christians are rugged. They don't whine like entitled brats. They are strong, resilient, and anti-fragile. Future-proof Christians are on the offense. They are builders and innovators and culture makers. They've got the guts to boldly assert the lordship of Jesus Christ over all of life. The future belongs to multi-generational families, godly men, women, children, and households. They labor to pass down a faithful legacy for their grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Be part of a movement that's unshaken, unashamed, and ready to shape the world for God's glory. We've reclaimed the offensive. We've got the momentum. God's enemies are in retreat. The time is now. Join us.
Yeah, that's 100%. I've seen that in my own ministry. I've experienced that myself, and I'd like to actually go in that direction because I think my concern at least is how churches can benefit from this teaching and learn and not commit the sin of empathy in the way that you defined it or be manipulated by somebody doing this. And so the material, I think, hits pastors hard. And because they see this in their ministries. And so there is this expectation from the congregation of what a pastor is. And a pastor is kind of the chief therapist over the church. And so he, of all people, must be tenderhearted, gracious, compassionate. And like there is a cluster of virtues that are fixated upon, that are more emotive and therapeutic. And then there are other virtues and skills and duties that are, secondary to them, speaking the truth, but speaking the truth in love. There's always the qualifier that it's got to be spoken in such a way that makes us feel good. Because if a pastor says or does something that makes people feel bad or feel shame or feel guilty just through executing his office faithfully, then he's a bad guy and I can't trust him. And I think a lot of pastors then are kind of in this crucible where to do faithful ministry alienates the very people that he's trying to minister to.
Right.
And then when he tries to speak to it, it says, hey, I've got this book by Joe Rigney. This book has been very helpful. I think you should read it. And then it elicits the same reaction. I know you were a pastor before. I don't know if you're an elder in a church now, but so you as a pastor, can you put it into practice? Like, how do we live this out in ways that don't alienate us from our congregations?
Yeah. So I think one of the things I had to develop through this was, okay, I see this excessive, untethered empathy wrecking things, and we need to resist it. but I don't want to become, I don't want to be callous, right? Like compassion's still a virtue, whatever abuses it's been subject to. Mother love is still glorious, even though maternal vampires exist. And so I was like, how do you maintain that? And so I did a lot of thinking about this. And I, as a pastor, we encountered all sorts of just horrors, from abuse to deaths to sicknesses and illnesses and cancers and, mothers who died and babies who died. And so you got all of these things. And each of those and all of those provide opportunities for the wrong kind of compassion, because in her grief, a mother might say, curse God and die. And you need to be Job in that moment. How are you going to be Job in that moment when this grieving mother is just angry at God? How are you going to do that? Or when someone's in a deep, dark pit of depression and saying all sorts of things, and they're sort of expecting you to join them in it. And you're going, but I don't think I'm supposed to join you in your doubts and your depression. I can't, I don't want to sink into it, but if I don't, right? So what I eventually came up with was kind of these 4 statements that kind of frame how I want to respond when people are hurting. And the first statement was simply, this is hard. So whatever it is, this is true whether it's suffering like a tragedy or whether it's evil has been done like abuse. And this you can say this even if you don't know the full story yet, right? In other words, it's the kind of statement I was like, this is true because it's an objective statement. This is hard is a statement about reality, but doesn't imply that I'm not saying I agree with everything you just said, or I agree with everything that the other guy just said, or I'm not making any judgments. I'm just simply acknowledging this is hard. That's number 1. The second thing I would say was, I know you feel that way. In other words, the good part of what people were trying to get at with, this empathy breeds connection kind of idea was, do people feel seen and understood? And so I know you feel that way is a recognition that on the one hand, there's an objective thing that I do agree with you. This is hard. I know you feel that way as a way of saying, I see your emotions. I recognize your felt reality, but it doesn't go as far as what untethered empathy would demand, which is, I know you feel that way and I agree. And I validate that. I affirm that, right? Your feelings are valid. That's the thing that I don't think that you can do, right? You can't give that blank check because their feelings might be sinful. Their response to these great evils might be blasphemous. You can't just validate them. And if you do, this is one of the things that would happen is I had people who were saying, there's curriculums that I saw were being written that were basically, in the name of empathy, validate other people's emotions, and technically what they meant is acknowledge them. But the language of validate it means your feelings are valid. And I go, once you've started down that road, it's really hard to pull it back. You've sort of committed yourself. You've nodded along with them as they've said stuff to such a degree that now if you later try to come back and say, actually, I don't think that that's true, there's going to be a legitimate sense of betrayal because you just spoke out of both sides of your mouth. You said one thing in one moment and then another. And so I said, don't do the validate in that sense. Instead, acknowledge, I know you feel that way. Okay, that's 2. And then the third was, I'm with you in this. So just, I'm present, I'm not going anywhere. And then the fourth was, I have hope. And the I have hope was really, really important because that's where the anchor came from, right? And so, because when people are hurting, they really want you to join them all the way in their despair. And if you won't, you don't really love me. If you won't join me all the way in my misery, if you won't share it all the way down, including my despair, including my anger, including my shaking my fist at God or my hostility to others, if you won't join me in my loves and my hates and everything else, if you won't join me all the way, you don't love me. And I have hope was a way of saying I see it. This is hard. I know you feel that way and I'm down here with you, but I am anchored to something outside of this pit. And those were not statements that I necessarily would say in any given interaction, but they were all in the mix. Because sometimes the way that you have hope the way you would communicate that was simply by your steady presence that maintained your own confidence in Christ and your own joy, even as the other person was sort of sinking, right? And so I'm not saying, hey, I have hope, you should too. I'm not trying to steer them out. I'm just saying, I can't go with you into you feel like God's abandoned you. That's how you feel. I know you feel that way. And I'm here with you, but I have hope. He hasn't abandoned you, right? Like, and so that needs to come through as much as this is heavy, this is hard, right? The tears and the heaviness, all that can be there, but I have hope. That package was what, to me, that's tethered compassion. That's what Christ modeled for us. That's what the Bible commends to us. That's what I want to see.
Outstanding counsel. I think that those 4 statements alone will serve pastors and churches very well as they enter into very difficult situations. One final question. Thank you for your time. You graciously accepted the invitation to come speak at the conference we've got coming up May 8th through 10th. The question that is kind of framing the way I'm approaching this conference in general is, what do we need to prepare for now? Or what do we need to do now to prepare for faithful Christian living in the next 20 years? And I was wondering if you had a snippet or some nugget that you could share about what you think Christians can do now to prepare for the next 20 years.
Yeah. So the direction I'm going to go with my talk, I think, it could change. It's still a month out. But right now is to look at the book of Judges as this time when everyone's doing what's right in their own eyes. And you basically have, the center isn't holding, and you have this tribalism. Okay. And tribalism is really complicated to navigate. And so to think about, what does it mean if we right now in the West, in America, for example, there are at least 2 big tribes, there's 2 major tribes. And yet even within those 2 tribes, there are sub-tribes, right? So even within, if you boil it down to sort of Republicans and Democrats, or MAGA and the progressives, right? Even within the Trump supporting coalition, which I would put myself, you'd put yourself in that coalition. We look at some of the other members of that tribe and we go, I don't know, not that. They've not got it yet. So tribal identity. So thinking about tribal identities and how to faithfully navigate them so that there could be alignments and coalitions to accomplish certain purposes, but without full allegiances. And it's those sort of things that I think are going to be complicated as Christians sort of have to team up with other Christians and then non-Christians for the sake of social order and so forth, that I think get really complicated. And I think the book of Judges gives us some windows into what God might expect of us as his people, and where are the places that we can, and Joshua would be wrapped up in this too. Where can we sort of align, and where do we have to draw lines, things like that. So that's the basic kind of frame that I have. And I haven't worked out even necessarily what all of those points would be. Like what do we do in a tribal situation? So in the next month or so, that's what I'm planning to be mulling and thinking about.
Yeah. Well, I can't wait to hear it. I'm very excited that you're coming.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time today, Dr. Rigney. It's a pleasure having you on.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael. Always good to be with you.
Yeah. That's it for this episode of the Plain Speech Podcast. For information about the Future Proof Christianity Conference, go to futureproofchristianity.com. You'll be able to hear from Dr. Rigney, Tom Askell, Jeff Durbin, Michael Foster, C.R. Wiley, David Schrock, and myself. Hope to see you there, and we'll see you next time on the Plain Speech Podcast.